So in theory, this would be my camera working. Let's find out. Okay, I guess I can shut off the monitor thing because this would be... Yep. I can be heard and everything. Yep, so let me see. I'm going to pop out the chat. I actually don't get to see... it's probably a bit of a long buffer, but it's not any kind of, like any naughty saying buffer so much as it is just the system running as fast as it can. I mean, I'm sending everything off to YouTube land and so let's see, I'll scooch the YouTube out of the way. And hey, Tiki, how's it going? Oh, can you tell how fast the YouTube is? Or is it you were just going by when I said boo? Because that wasn't literally exactly the instant that I started doing anything. My system specs is an older iMac, one of the first iMacs that is Retina screen. Yeah, so... Hi there, Tiki. I'm going to be doing this on a regular basis. Oh, goodness. I'm going by when you're answering my questions. Yes, I only just saw that one. Yes, if you want to time it more tightly, well, you can say something and I'll respond very closely to that. Also, maybe I can... there we go. Fiddle with the volume of this thing so that it's not blowing up the output too much. OBS has that. It is handy. Yeah, that's not the best timing approach I've ever seen. I'm curious as to whether I have a... Hey, Yuri. A participants thing. I kind of do. I just can't see that and the chat at the same time, which is irritating, but whatever. So hey, the idea is I'm going to do this on a regular basis. In fact, I'm going to do this every Monday at this time. How long depends upon how long people need me to be answering questions or whatever. But I think I should show up and be able to talk to folks about plugins or whatever else it is that they want to talk about. There's even other people who would wander by and say hello who might not even be plugin users in the same sense, because I've sometimes done things like live streams and such that weren't even plugin oriented. I should probably get something out of the... I don't need to be looking at my own face on the screen. It makes me look over here rather than looking at who's there. Hello, Mute himself. Mute himself. You probably don't need to mute yourself on this stream because we're kind of informal. I might at some point figure out a way of getting the chat on screen too. I don't think I've got that figured out today. So we will just do what we can, and although I can try to keep a running pattern going as if I was making a video, oh, please do. This is the whole point, is if you want to ask questions, I can answer them. I even have my lovely coffee. Check it out. This is the mug from my family house, and so far the only thing that I've got from the deaths of my parents over the last year. everything else is tangled up in legalisms, but I was like, can I take that mug home with me? I've always treasured it, and so I did. But yeah, shoot, ask your question. Another possibility is doing Google Hangouts and just letting people join. Oh, no. You misunderstand Buttercomp. I have a pad of paper handy so that I can explain things with visual aids and drawing them with a pen. And that I will proceed to do immediately. Good question. I have been too bogged up with stuff to, Hangouts would have more interplay and talk. There is that. VCV Rack, as far as I know, I am still able to run it. And I need to build the source from scratch again, as I finally did a while back. I have been too bogged down with other things to quite catch up with how VCV Rack works. Now let me bounce back to Buttercomp. So, waveform. Waveform with a lot of splotches in it, which is interesting. That's because this pen produces a lot of ink. It's a Pilot G210. It smears too, so I'll be cautious with it. The way that VCV Rack works, the way that Buttercomp works. Initially, the basic idea is that you have a positive and a negative form compressor. And if something goes really intensely positive, it will compress that. Tiki, as far as implementing user feature requests, you can mention whatever, and it depends upon whether it's easy for me to just sort of roll into stuff. There are a number of times I've done things. There's some times where features are not what that particular plugin was supposed to be, in which case it's not. As for multiple streams of income, no, complicated question, because on the one hand, it is the Patreon. I used to get people doing things like buying stuff for me, or trying to pay me for the older school plugins on PayPal. But that has declined. And the rest of it is I live up in Vermont, and the place I'm in actually qualifies as a Section 8 property. It's a thing that they called Section 8 Homeownership Program. And a bunch of years ago, like more than a decade ago, when I was actually homeless, I ended up getting a Section 8 voucher, meaning that I had housing subsidy. And I lived in various apartments. Some of my early work done on the program mastering tools was done in an apartment in Wilmington that was a Section 8. And through a complicated series of events, I ended up basically able to take on a mortgage and own a house in sort of the seedy area of Bellows Falls, Vermont, which is not that seedy, really, because it's not a very big city, or a big town even. And the fact is that my housing is not as costly as some people would, and that's why I'm able to do this Patreon thing rather than have it immediately ruin me and destroy me upon trying it. Because for the initial part of there, it was not bringing in enough money to pay for anything. But eventually it was, and the threshold of me being able to support myself through that is not terribly high. So yeah, back to Buttercomp. Buttercomp has the plus side of the waveform and the minus side of the waveform. So if you needed to turn down the plus side of the waveform to that much, you could take the amplitude of only this side and turn it down. at which point this side would not be turned down. So it's either side is getting a separate volume control. And what that means is that you could end up with, like, say, if this was turned down all the way and this was not, you could wind up with a weird distorted wave like this. That generates second harmonic, but it also generates an artifact as it crosses zeros. So what Buttercomp does is it sort of interpolates between the two. Like at a +1 or beyond, you're getting only the positive side of the wave, and if on the -1, you're getting only the minus side of the wave, and in between, you get an interpolation. Now, what makes Buttercomp be more complicated than that is, say these are samples. I've got two separate, I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be. Two separate compressors on each side, and they are interleaving. Like, you've got compressor A and compressor B, and compressor A only handles odd-numbered samples, and compressor B only handles even-numbered samples. And then there's also another one on the negative side, meaning that there's 4. And so when I say there's 4 compressors in Buttercomp, that's what that means. Each of those are completely independent. Although in some implementations, I have had them blend in various ways, but in the purest version of the algorithm, they're completely independent, meaning that if you have a oh, here's another question. Have I made any changes to Purist Drive? No, I don't think I did. I don't think I did. I think it's exactly the way that it was. It always had that tone quality affecting thing in its code. Yuri, if I am successfully explaining this or not successfully explaining this, make a note, say something in chat. Because at some point I'm going to stop and be finished with explaining how Buttercomp is. This is more or less the gist. But where it gets interesting is where it gets into things like Purist Squish, which is coming along. Purist Squish is going to be coming out, I don't remember exactly when. It's this month or that next month. And Buttercomp being able to overcompress is a separate thing. That's the way that each of these individual compressors work, whereas Buttercomp is the positive and negative sides of the waveform and the interleaving, and the interleaving is a unusual way of doing things. I do filters that way as well. The idea for that, the reason for the interleaving, is I'm working on the concept that when you take samples, and here I'll use the other side of this page. I'm toying with the idea of like doing this and then maybe sending people the notes, but that's going to take a little more complicated working around. But maybe that can be a Patreon thing. It's like, oh, if you spend a whole bunch of money on Patreon, I'll do these and then I'll send you the actual notes in the mail. That'd be amusing. But here's another waveform. And you're trying to record something like this. And you've got these individual sample points that are recording, you'd think, the point where it intersects the wave. But that's not true. That is not how sampling works. The way sampling works is like this. You've got, say, a waveform that is going to do something weird and extreme, and you've got these sample points that, well, the notes are on screen now, so that's basically what that's about. These are not wonderfully drawn or anything. I'm going to need to get a better pen, like a magic marker or something. that I can draw these more effectively. If you have sample positions that are trying to record something like this, they're not going to be able to, but they're going to try to get as close as possible to it. So you can wind up with something like this. This is called a Dirac impulse. If your samples are drawn so that it's like 0, 0, all the way to the top, 0, 0, 0, sampling calls that a Dirac impulse, and it represents a waveform that is not actually a single little spike, because sampling can't record a single little spike. The wave, the sampling rate won't cover it. To go suddenly from here to here and then back again is too quick. And sampling won't actually do that. So if you were doing a Dirac impulse and trying to generate it through just capturing it from analog, the waveform that you would be capturing is kind of like this. It may have the exact shape of the lobes not correctly shaped, but if you gave this waveform to a sampler, it could produce a Dirac impulse. And maybe I'll put some more sample points in here to illustrate where it's actually being done. And the reason is that we can't record frequencies higher than the single points. Now, there are ways to cheat. There are sample playback DACs, digital analog converters, that are designed to not have a reconstruction filter. So when they put out an output, they can put out an output that goes like that. And maybe it can make a shape like that, but that shape has nothing to do with what the original recording is. And when people talk about, stair steps and digital audio, that is not actually what you get out of a normal converter, because the normal converter smooths things out. Also, I did something that was an error here. You see how this goes to the point that's being shown? Like the sampled point? That's actually wrong. It didn't actually go there. If you are making a waveform with a Dirac impulse and the reconstruction filter is supposed to draw the waveform that was represented by this, it really does act like a little slalom course where the resulting audio dodges around the sample points to get to what the real waveform was, and it goes up here. And you'll notice I've just drawn on my horrible little notepad because this has gone beyond the ability to reproduce. The converter has clipped, and that's what they call Gibb effect. That's what they call intersample overs. You've got the sample, and the sample goes to a legal number, but when the reconstruction filter hits it, it's dodging around the sample points. And then when you've got this one here, it goes, oh, I must dodge around this and go all the way out here and then come back. And it can easily clip. So when you have some other people specialize in heavily oversampling clippers, for instance, Kazarok does a very good one, like K-Clip. And I think one of the things of that product is that he has very, very high levels of oversampling. And this is what you get, is the ability to clip to a point like this. Say if you have, remember this shape. dot, 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 dot. Since you have to do that shape, since you have to dodge around these points, you can't simply go from the one point to the other point. I mean, in a digital analog converter that has no reconstruction, you could. And it'll go at whatever speed the op amps and things could do. For instance, you could do one where it can do this, but the op amps are like old guitar pedal style classic op amps, and that means that it can only go like a fast, and so it'll slow down what would be a much faster thing because the actual analog parts of the circuit can't do it that fast. But if you're doing the reconstruction, you got to remember that you can start straight like this, then you start having to do that wiggling around, and it will end up, and this is probably another reason why sampling sounds the way that it does. It must go around the waveforms and not actually touch them in order to generate a signal that's within the range, and I'm not sure if that can lead to, I think it probably can't lead to a waveform that's faster than it really should be going from the one point to the next. I've drawn it that way. I doubt that it actually quite goes that way. I think it'll probably move a little bit slower, but you'll notice that the attempt to do the oversampling, when you start messing with the positions of samples, it will start trying to sharpen these transition points, and indeed sharpen them beyond what you can literally have. And that might be one of the reasons why digital audio's high frequencies are not, I'm actually going to say traditionally seen as all that super wonderful. They're potentially a problematic area. And a lot of people who are very much in love with digital audio will argue that like crazy. But really highs are where people find issue with digital audio. And things like, for instance, lows, not so much of a problem. Digital audio can contain DC voltages and stuff as much as you like, and nothing necessarily needs to change with that at all. There is one point on low frequencies, however. Low frequencies are determined by how easily you can lock on to a very slow rate of change of the samples. So what I've found is it's easier to keep track of bass if you're keeping very, very close track of the resolution of these positions. And if they are, say, quantized, so that they only, they're at a particular place, and then they jump to the next available one, and so on, which is what quantization does. You're using lower resolution for the numbers involved. It makes it harder to keep track of what the bass actually is. You've got all the bass. Still, it's representing whatever voltage this is, and that will never go away, and it's not even that wildly different from what it would be, but it's harder to hear it if it's got like these artifacts coming in every time you have a bass note. It's easier to hear it if it's super accurately tracking the waveform, which is why I do dithering and word length reduction, not just another dither and stuff. That kind of stuff makes it easier to hear what the bass actually is, even though quantized stuff will still record what the bass technically is just as well. It's very close, but the smallest little departures from a smooth transition like that will make it harder to hear whether bass is actually happening. So yeah, that's bouncing around among a number of things. Just a moment. Tiki is wondering whether Purist Drive is hanging onto the peaks as strongly as before the VST release. That's, well, what you might be hearing is just, now I'm not sure. Yeah. Fritz Kaiser says, to be fair, at the upper limit of our hearing at 44.1, we literally have triangle waves. And even though they're only perfect triangles that interact. Yeah, but basis, remember that you may still be assuming that samples represent points where the audio goes to. And so you don't actually have triangle waves. The sampling is just showing you that those are the slalom goalposts that you're going around. They could be perfect triangles if they are integer factors of the sample rate, but that does not mean they can go around the top corner. Here, I'll illustrate. Boop, 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 boop. This is not a triangle wave. Not in a sampling theorem, because you cannot make this corner. Because to make that corner would be an incredibly high frequency. Instead, what you've got is something where it'll go. You're representing that wave with the triangle. So in order to have a triangle, you need to have a different shape of samples. And they're going to be rounded off a little bit. That's one of the reasons why I've been doing a lot, like almost everything that I do has some form of high frequency roll off, or I'm just nudging the samples around, making them flatten, making them not go to these sharp points, because I know that the reconstruction filter can't handle it. So it's always about trying to minimize. Thing that you also notice, it's always the same frequency, because that's a brick wall filter. So that's a ringing that's like right up around the sampling rate, and it's not really a ringing at all. This is just the shape of a triangle wave once all of the higher frequencies have been removed, but there's an artificiality to that. So you wouldn't really call that a ringing, but if you look at it at a much higher frequency, yeah, Yuri says, thanks, it seems clear. So your approach to the baseband processing dithering is applicable to most of my plugins. Well, all the plugins do have some form of dithering or word length reducing in them, because they all go to a higher resolution internally and then go back down. But dithering isn't the same as the sample rate stuff. The sample rate stuff is completely independent of dithering. Like you could have dithering and it would be randomly moving around these little things, but that could still end up making what appears to be a point, which is really just this overshoot. That's the slalom thing, and it's making you do a crazy slalom around the most extreme point. Dithering wouldn't affect that choice at all. Dithering would simply be moving all of the samples a tiny direction in one direction or another. So dithering is, or could be, because you could make choices of dither where you're deciding, are we going in a consistent direction, or are we trying to make some kind of corner, do a extreme point like that, at which time you would always decide to make the dither be lower rather than higher. That's worth making a note about. Maybe we have a new product happening. Yay. Let me find... and this one has to be called Dither Me Timbers, by God. I finally get to use that one. Dither and point the direction, and in theory you could make that decision based on what the shape of the thing was. Now that wouldn't necessarily help you in terms of linearity, but it might have an effect in terms of softening highs, so I don't know. Declicker is a little bit awkward. Hey, Muterex, finally? Finally about what? I have not... Ah, yeah. Were you one of the people who voted for that? I loved that one. I think not just another dither is fine. Not just another dither is perhaps more sensible. But, yeah. The DAC tells the future in the way that I've drawn, because the DAC's purpose is generating it. It is much the same as if you were taking a waveform in this sampling rate and going like, okay, computer, resample this to 192 kilohertz. And what the computer will do is go, okay, so we're going to take these points and we're going to synthesize what's in the middle. Well, we can't just linearly do that. So what we're going to do is take this and perhaps start at a sort of square wave analysis. I've done audio restoration plugins. I'm not saying I'm not doing it. I'm just saying I've got stuff in the pipeline at the moment. I've done an azimuth corrector that I have notes on doing more of, and the problem with declickers is this: I like making stuff that doesn't have latency. I'm not even sure how I can manage to do a plugin with latency in old school VST. I think maybe I can't, which would mean I could do a plugin like that, and you'd have to just get used to the idea that it comes with a time delay. In VST, I think it would just have that time delay, and in Audio Unit, it would declare the time delay, and then it would act as if it had no latency, but then everything that you touch would have latency. Your entire, like if I, and I've done this with the old sample delay plugin on Audio Unit. If you have a declared latency of half a second, and then you have a delay that will go between 0 and 1 second, and you set it to 0.5, you have a negative delay. That's what sample delay was, in which as it delays the half second, then the delay compensation in Logic with the Audio Unit plugins kicks in, and it makes it seem as if there was no delay being applied. But if you notice, you're delaying everything by half a second because you've got delay compensation happening. So your latency has just gone to half a second. You can no longer play anything into the mix. So I do not like working with stuff that has super duper high latency. And if I did a really good declicker, it would probably have a pretty high latency. So that slows me down as far as doing that, because I'd be having to explain it. Be like, yep, here's your VST, and this is why this one has such a long delay on it. So back to the DAC telling the future in the way that I've drawn. I don't know how. If somebody shows me how, then I can start doing it. I am not great at interpreting these very largely undocumented things about the format. I have never been able to find a coherent... I think that maybe what you're supposed to do is be reading their source code or something, or digging through their... It's been rather messy. A few people have helped me out in the industry, and I am very grateful to them. Notably, Zaphod from Acoustica Audio jumped in and helped me with a couple of things, and I appreciate that greatly. And Destroy Effects. Anyways, the reason I'm not thinking clearly is because I'm trying to answer this. How does the delay? And that is the point. You can have the latency if you just know that you're having it. How does the DAC tell the future? It's not. Instead, what it's doing is this. You've got all these little subdivisions like that. You're starting from the, it might be the guy from Mixhip. You mean Zepha Giancarlo? Yeah, he is on forums sometimes. And the computer doesn't have these points. So what it does is it takes these initial points. It does some form of interpolation or whatever, and then goes, okay, what do we get when we filter this and filter all of these corners? You could say, corners of just the most primitive version of figuring it out. If we filter all these off, what do we get? Oh, Jolie Burris says, good thing Zepha didn't teach you how to deal with the public arrogantly. He didn't have to teach me. I've been doing this for 10 years. I started off dealing with the public arrogantly. I had to learn not to. Everybody goes through this. That's another really good little point. By the way, have you got all the information at this point before this is going to be the ADD live stream, I can tell already. That what it's doing is it's taking, I'm going to be managing that. I understand why that sort of thing happens. But it's filtering, and there's a latency involved in converting the sample rate. Like, you're not getting a zero latency conversion from the low sample rate to the high sample rate. And converters that produce analog output are usually doing something like this in order to be able to do the reconstruction filter. You can't do a reconstruction filter at the rate that you're working at, so they will always do something to work at a higher level. That's also how delta sigma sampling works, is that it's sampling at a much higher rate at a much lower resolution, and then smoothing it down to the lower one. All of this stuff that ends up with waveforms going around sample positions is done through running a much higher rate and calculating it out by filtration. So it's kind of the same as doing low-pass filters in the computer, because it literally is. And that's how we do that. Pre-ringing means you are doing like this much latency and calculating it out. So as that moves along, eventually you get to the point where you figured out, like, okay, here's where this one is because we have done this entire convolution kernel. Pre-ringing means it's gone through everything with a filter that extended in both directions, which is what an FIR filter can easily do. Yeah, I enjoyed the not focus, Tiki, don't worry about it. At some point I will want to include the thing on the screen. I wonder if I can actually make that happen. That'll be amusing. Probably not. I'm not sure whether I want to do that right now, though. Maybe I'll do it a different time. I have a bunch of questions that are going on. Yeah, hopefully it retains the chat. Maybe people watching this back, if I tell it to keep the chat, maybe it'll keep the chat. Anyways. Yeah, pre-ringing means I'm going to have to swing wide to get through this next corner, and it also means that the filter thing that is making the new waveform happen has a bunch of time to think about it. There's always a bunch of latency. It's never generating a shape like that or generating a pre-ringing shape and doing it on the fly as it goes. It's always doing a phase accurate filter, because the purpose of a shape like that with one lobe on either side is that it is linear phase. It has the ringing on both sides, but it's not manipulating phase. And as many analog filters mess with phase in a big way, if I'm not mistaken, but digital filters don't have to. And they can, yes, work backwards in time. You can calculate both this direction and then like combine them both, or, but it's always involving latency. It's always like, okay, we're going to do this stuff and then put out the result a little bit later when we've got it all sorted out, when we figured out what it's going to be. And the number of samples involved aren't all that huge, so it's not that big of a latency. But then the pre-ringing is always about, let's look at this little pool of samples and figure out what our answer is going to be, and then a little while later we'll start writing down what we have settled upon. So yeah, I'm going to touch on the dealing with the public thing because I know multiple people, of which I am one of them, that has dealt with that as a challenge. There's also, like over here, my little modular stuff, one of the things that you probably can't see from where you're standing, but I have got a plugin called Mini Shimmery, or a module called Mini Shimmery, and a module called the Sour Filter, which uses a LM4250 op amp. And these are made by Blue Lantern. And Blue Lantern went through a period exactly like me, and like Zaphod as well, as far as doing stuff, being enthusiastic and charging about doing things. And I think specifically Blue Lantern, his thing was he was using a publicly available open source hardware thing to build some of his stuff and didn't credit the person the way that they wanted, or didn't credit the person the way that his audience wanted. And then got in arguments with people, and it blew up and became one of those viral things. And that's often how that works. I mean, that's how it worked for me. Like, back in the day, I think the one where I got the most fiercest striking down was, it was actually, back in the day I had more cats. I currently have none, but I had these sort of elderly aging cats, and one of them had cancer in a terrible way. His name was Neville. He was a very sweet old cat, but he had a big problem, which was this big tumor, and this was before Patreon, and I could not afford to do anything about it. And I was coming up with a plugin that I called AD Clip. And we probably recognize AD Clip because I've been through 7 versions of that, and it's found a place in the world. But back then, there was not that much going on with it. And another fellow who's known for being angry at brass marching bands on the show floor when he was trying to talk, had another plugin, which was, if I'm not mistaken, called FGX. And he, as is his wont, and as he always does, was going around saying that his thing was absolutely marvelous, but he was also saying all clippers are now obsolete. Don't bother paying attention to any of that stuff. I have made it completely obsolete. Nobody will use anything but my new thing. It's going to be amazing and great and wonderful. And this is even before it came out. Never mind, people have been asking for a version 2 of that one and so on. And I incorporated some of the basic things it did into first 3D Clip and then successive versions of AD Clip, because I was not implementing them in anything like the same way that he was doing. But at the time, I got real salty about this because, I was, yes, Jolie, that's who it is. I don't need to attack him anymore because he can, he's on his own ride through things. But back in the day, I was really upset and angry because I was trying to launch this particular plugin, and you can't guarantee that a plugin is going to necessarily work. And I wasn't really making the kind of income where I could say, like, if this plugin is a big success, I can, get an operation for my cat, which I did not end up doing. The cat ended up dying of cancer, and that was very sad. And I wasn't really in any position to be mad at anybody for getting in the way of that rather lofty goal. I mean, healthcare. Oh my God, healthcare. I have sympathy for the people who get in trouble in the promotional sense because they speak too loosely and diss on each other and stuff. You know, one of the people who scolded me and taught me a lesson as far as that kind of stuff was, in fact, Eric Seraphin, Mixerman, because I was on his forum, and I was getting into arguments about things like other vendors and whether their stuff was good and so on his forum, and that was his forum. So he was like, I'm not having manufacturers doing this in public around the forum. He no longer has the forum, but that gave him basically the moral authority to give me a talking to and say, look, stop doing that. It's unprofessional. It's ridiculous. You don't have to. We'd rather you didn't, and I need you to stop right now or I'll kick your ass off. I don't remember whether he threatened to kick my ass off. He very easily could have, but I'm not sure if he would have. Just that was the position of authority that he had, where whether I liked it or not, I had to listen. Whether or not he said anything about like, oh, I kick your ass off, I was always thinking, oh my God, this is his forum. Therefore, if he wanted to, he could kick my ass off. So I had to listen. And I ended up deciding that I was happier just pulling this sort of Mr. Rogers, Bob Ross thing and just trying to be nice to everybody all the time. Because if you fret about stuff like the injustices of other plugin makers and so on and so forth, you just lose sleep over it and it doesn't really stop anything. Like there's stuff that I see coming out where sometimes I wonder to myself, like, oh, here's somebody who's flashy and new, and they're doing a product that seems as if they're in very much the same territory as something that I just open sourced last week. And that's only going to continue, all the more so since I have open sourced everything. And since it's open source, it can be brought into other people making tools to do like GUI plugins or whatever and dragging in the source code of stuff that I do. If it's not already possible, and I've tried, it's not possible for me yet, but if it's not already possible to take things and go, okay, so let's take this and this and this and this and Air Windows plugin, stick a GUI on it, put a knob here, a knob there, have that stuff be under the hood, and then export a plugin and sell it. If that's not already possible, it will be. So it becomes a matter of pretty much being able to have visibility. And the fact is that's something that will happen. The more people have access to tools and the ability to construct things of their own, the more that will happen. And it's a wholly separate problem from doing the plugins and doing the code and stuff. Like, optimally, I would be making stuff where people could take the code, honor my opinions about it, and be like, oh, I guess I will keep doing all of this stuff the way Chris wants it, and putting out their own plugins, maybe with their skinning or their GUI or whatever, that sound literally as good as anything that I made because they're using literally what I made in order to do it. That's why I expressed the MIT license as being credit me. And with a lot of the stuff that I do, especially crazy things like console and whatever, if you don't know what you're doing with them, you can tell. Like, you can tell by analyzing stuff and running pathological signals into it, whether somebody's using like the noise shaping to the floating point bus or whatever. You can get a sort of audio microscope going on and run test signals and determine whether or not people are literally using my code or not. And at that point, I would just be looking for credit, because the idea is putting this stuff out so that other people can use them. I think people should be able to make digital audio plugins that actually sound good. If I didn't think that was true, I wouldn't be open sourcing things, like, at all. I wasn't open sourcing things for 10 years when I was running it for Mac only, and I'm open sourcing things now, so people are supposed to be using that code. Let me look through some of the chat. If you're listening to the playback, and hopefully it retains the chat. I don't know whether it will or not, but I hope that it does. I'll see whether there's anything that I missed, because there probably is. Gamma 1734, who's also showed up for some of my music streams, says, "Hey Chris, hope you're fine." I'm pretty fine. I'm reasonably fine. Deresing audio, rolling that into a delay to model those lovely, sparkly, early digital delays. Well, I've done something kind of like that, in that I did, what the hell is it? Starchild. Starchild is not like a early digital delay, it's more like a funny effect that I'm going to get to what Oversight Entertainment just said. I thought that this was likely to go beyond simply Q&A about plugins and into the larger size of things. I have every intention of talking about all of that stuff, but you must remember that I'm taking that sort of Bob Rossi kind of attitude, which is also kind of a cynical attitude at the same time. So there's some stuff that I think you just have to deal with, and try not to get too bent out of shape about. I have not yet done a delay where the delay taps were deresed, and that's an interesting thought. It hadn't occurred to me, so I'll scribble that down as a note as well. I will note also that if you wanted that really badly, you could do that right now if you had Blue Cat's, somebody prompt me, Blue Cat's delay plugin, where you can put effects into the delays and feedback loop. In fact, I'm going to just go and look that up right now, because I'm shouting him out, and I enjoy the Blue Cat developer so much. Late replies. Blue Cat delay immediately gave me late replies, and late replies is the one where you can host deres on the echoes. So you can do that right now, and then I'll make a note about doing something like that in future. Because that is an interesting thought. I have been asked for a sort of generic, sparkly digital thing to just include on everything. I haven't done that one yet, but it would be almost like a preset on deres efficiently set up, so you just drop it on. It would be one of those ones where it doesn't even have any controls. You just drop it on, and it kind of old schoolifies things, and probably cuts out quite a lot of the extreme highs while I'm at it. But when I was talking about Effectrons, Delta Labs Effectrons, I can't do one that was too inspired by the Delta Lab Effectron, because I have two of those. I had 3, and then I kept the Effectron 2s that have the long delays. The reason I can't do it in Effectron is that an Effectron is not PCM digital. An Effectron is a really old primitive version of essentially DSD, like an SACD. So it's not actually recording stair steps of quantized rates. It doesn't quantize. All it's doing is recording the angle at which you go, and it's just kind of cranking on those. Oh, if I'm breaking up, it's probably because the stream will do that sometimes. Let me get this out. I am looking at it, and my thing is continuing to say that there are no dropped frames. So If I'm breaking up really bad, first of all, I apologize, and second of all, you guys can have me shut up until it smooths out. Or just roll with it, I guess. I won't have a captured version of this because this is just live, but if I start breaking up like crazy, then you can... Okay. Yeah, it is going to be different in various different places. So, fair enough. I got a bunch of people saying it's fine where they're at. I'll keep going. I have a number of questions that I'm catching up on. Tiki has asked, how many hours do I usually spend in VSTing an already existing plugin? Well, that really depends upon how well it goes. Because often I'm needing to make it be stereo so that the ordinary VST will handle it. As much as possible, I try to bring them up a notch, which sometimes works and occasionally doesn't. Most of the time, I'm trying to not literally... I mean, when they're the popular ones, or when there are special ones like DS, I dialed it back to a original version because that original version was very popular with people. And as you've seen in the threads on some of that stuff, I still have more work to do on DS, but even if I had recognized that, I would want to release the original version because that original version was the favorite of a bunch of people. So I wanted that to be available. If I have very little to do, it can be a few hours or so. I have to kind of get my head in the game. Honestly, one of the things that is most likely to happen is that I will try to bundle a bunch of them together. Like I'll do 4 or 5 plugins, and I'll do all the VSTing for the plugin, at the same time. And then I'll be doing the porting to Windows and the porting to Linux, and I'll be doing those as also a sort of getting up ahead of steam and being like, okay, let's do 8 plugins and Windows them and stuff. So the question of how many hours it takes it's not always a matter of just grinding away on one. It's a matter of spending like 12 hours doing a burst of them in one stage of the process. And that's something that you can use for many other forms of things. For instance, cartoonists do the same kind of stuff. They will be like, okay, I have a book to do, therefore I am sketching the entire book, and they're doing 24 pages. And then they'll go, okay, we're going to put them into panels now, and I'm going to color everything, and they'll go through and they'll color everything in the book. And it's a way of doing stuff very efficiently. There are many different ways where you can make that be a efficient way of doing stuff. And I'm here to tell you I'm doing that with the plugins as well. Like the creative, literally getting a new sound happening is going to be its own little section. It's probably going to be on the AU. And it's going to be, say, a bunch of hours tinkering away with something because I know what I'm trying to make it do. And I'm just messing with code to try to make it do the thing that I'm imagining. And then I'm also listening to hear whether it's doing something useful that I didn't expect. Let me keep scooting forward through these. I have somebody asking to do what an algorithmic orange EQ does. I don't specifically know what that is. We're going to get to the subject of people ripping off people because that's worth talking about. Let's see. Protect your IP regardless of your generosity is also the ripping off conversation. Thanks, Robert Babix, for giving masterclasses and showing my plugins to people. That's kind of why I'm doing them, is so that people have tools that they can use whether or not they have stuff. I think we're on that ripping off subject, and I'll be handling things carefully in the chat. Please don't shout at people that you think are jerks, because there's no real reason to focus on that. One fella has asked, do big VSD people use piracy to promote their plugins? I think probably not. I think piracy, if you want to call it piracy, is just kind of basically easy to do. Somebody will do it, and then the information gets out. And whether people release stuff that is pre-cracked is, I wouldn't expect it. And, when I was doing Air Windows as audio units only, I was doing zero digital rights management. I did not have any anti-piracy stuff whatsoever. And I let people know that. So essentially, for 10 years, I ran my thing saying, oh, well, I'm going to have to make a note of that. Fritz Kaser has just brought my attention to somebody's advertising a linear phase EQ without audible pre-echo or ringing. I think that's impossible, so I'll have a look at that. Let's see. I'm going to have to scroll up just a little bit in order to... Don't mind me. Just going to look into that, see if it makes any sense. Probably be reading some forum threads about it and stuff. Because you can't do linear phase without pre-ringing, because pre-ringing is the shape of audio filtering. Now you can doctor it, at which point it stops being quite linear phase. Anyways, put that aside. I don't know whether manufacturers put out stuff that is, quote, cracked or not. Honestly, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard, because I was in a position of wanting people to use stuff that was, quote unquote, pirated. And I'll tell you, as a small developer, it changes things that I don't have to manufacture stuff for people to take. Like, I never looked into how much Air Windows stuff was being copied around, because I didn't really want to know. I was trying to basically live, and the general overall trajectory of the music business as a whole has been kind of down, and selling stuff not through Patreon is kind of like up and down and all over the place anyway, so it's a little difficult keeping track. But I always put stuff out with no copy protection, and I was very clear about that because I wanted people to know I had their backs. If there's anybody that I do get snippy about, it's the people who are making complicated copy protection schemes, especially when they fail to do it perfectly, which they will fail to do it perfectly, because it just causes grief and trouble for people. And it's an attempt to do something that's very, very difficult. You know, it's like asking, like, what copy protection scheme do you put on digital money? There's bound to be trouble there somewhere. And even if there isn't trouble, it is already the trouble of how much effort are you putting into this? How much CPU of the person's computer are you grinding away at? How much space are you using? How much of their privacy are you invading in order to try to make it so that you're sure that they're not doing, you know, something that you've decided that they would not? So my way of dealing with that was always to I wouldn't say give the stuff away, but I was always aware that people would copy it and distribute it. So my job was making people aware that I wanted some form of recompense for it, because I was looking at a situation where anything I was likely to do, I wasn't going to be able, like anything I tried to do, I wouldn't be able to stop people trying to crack it. That was not going to be possible. I wasn't that good of a programmer or that kind of a programmer to be able to specialize in that stuff. I don't have that kind of expertise in the operating system and the guts of how the computer works. I work basically from templates, and that means that if I can make a gain plugin work, I can make anything audio that I'd like to work. But if I can't make the gain plugin work, then I'm kind of hosed. And now let me see. So that is the conversation about ripping off and stuff. Is my best approach, and my advice, in fact, is to just skip it. Just step out of that kind of thing and start dealing with people on the basis of, does what I do make you want to support me, help me out, give me money, buy me food, etc., etc.? If what I do doesn't make you want to do that, then maybe I shouldn't have your money. And it's a really interesting question because it brings you on to these other related questions, like Patreon, for instance. With Patreon, you have the capacity to post how much you're actually making and how many patrons you have. And you also have the capacity to hide how much you're making, post how many patrons you have, and let people guess. And I'll tell you the reason why that is a choice. The reason that is a choice is if you're doing the thing that you do and you're posting how much you're making, you'll get to a point kind of where I'm at, to be honest, where people decide, oh, you're making more than me, or you're not quite making more than me, but you're just sitting around making these plugins, and I have to go work digging ditches and lifting heavy things in the Amazon warehouse, breaking my back and becoming exhausted, and I'm absolutely miserable, and you don't look nearly as miserable as me. I don't think you should have as much money. And people will decide, like, well, you're making this much money. You don't need my help. You're fine. I'll just take your stuff because you're getting about as much as I think you should. And there is a way of thinking where people, and this also, it still touches on the whole piracy discussion, because it's the whole question of, like, how much do you think the dev should make? I think that's a complicated and interesting question. I've been thinking about a thing where, like, I build stuff, for instance. I've got things over here. I've got my modular thing. This that I'm pointing at with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a Axolotl board screwed on top of a sort of cigar box. And I put a bunch of knobs and things on there, so it's my little music computer. And it handles timing and key changes for some of the synthesizer stuff. And that's kind of crude, but I built it. I build other things, like I'm in the process of building this. I might be able to make it be more of a thing. It's a combination chord and mode slide rule that is just sort of circular. And I'm trying to make stuff where I can use it to think of interesting chord patterns and things. Like if I'm doing like E major, I tell it Ionian E major, and that's going to show me which of the notes are in that scale. And then if I'm in the Ionian mode, a major mode, and I'm making a chord, say I'm playing a G chord, the G chord is going to show me which of the parts of the G chord would also be in that mode. Like, technically I could play a diminished fifth as part of that chord. I could play a minor seventh. I could do a G minor seventh in E major, and that would more or less work. So I'm building things. My point being, I've thought of how to incorporate that with Patreon somehow. And I've had a wild idea that might actually be good. And I think it's fairly likely that literally nobody has done this because it's that wild. But I may give it a shot. One of the things that you could do on Patreon is things like go, okay, I'm going to do patron only this or patron only that, or pledge to this level to get this thing and so on. Or you can do stuff like, you could just put the thing on eBay. Be like, okay, I've made this thing, therefore I'm going to put a couple of them on eBay. Or, I'm working on plugins, I can only make one. I'm going to put it on eBay, and then the richest person that follows Air Windows is going to bid on it, and then they're the only one that can get to have it. Which I'm not sure if I'm thrilled about that idea. So I have thought of this angle of do the thing. Maybe if I have a cool thing that I build, there's some kind of like I have a wall of parts over there. And the wall of parts is such that I could build things like guitar stomp boxes, but I'm not really set up to become a manufacturer making dozens of guitar stomp boxes and selling them and getting into like Musician's Friend and all of that kind of stuff. That's a whole other thing that I don't have to deal with. So I'm not sure if I want to deal with it. So the idea that I had was build the thing or like have the thing. I buy gear, for instance, and then sometimes need to unload it. I've been taking stuff to my closest music store, which happens to be Retro Music in Keene, New Hampshire. I like them. They're very awesome. And consigning it. And it's fun consigning stuff, and sometimes you get to swap the stuff with other stuff. But technically, I might not necessarily have to do... Oh, yeah, by the way, yeah. The Rhodes is also from Retro Music. Technically, I could do a thing where I did a patron thing going, here is this thing that I've got, probably not the Rhodes, this thing that I built. And it's going to one of my patrons, so patrons only, please. And if you were a patron at any level, $1 and up, you can put your identity into some kind of lottery thing. And I got to check with Patreon to find out whether legally I can do that. And I might be able to, because of this, set it up in such a way where if you were a patron at any level and at any time, and you could even become a patron for $1 just in order to do this. And that's another ripping off people thing that people can do. And enter into that sort of lottery or raffle or whatever. And if you win the thing, I send it to you at my own expense. Now, it takes a little thinking to figure out how that would work, because on the face of it, it's the dumbest idea imaginable. It just costs me money and the thing, and I get nothing. But it is a perhaps very effective way of getting around that situation where people look at your Patreon and go, oh, yeah, you make enough money. You shouldn't have any more. Because if you were doing the thing where it's like, I'm living the dream, I'm making all this stuff, and I'm working on this thing, for 10 years I was working on plugins and things, and I was able to focus on that full time. But when I got on Patreon, that income got decimated for a while and then started to crawl back, and now it's very decent. But when you're doing the things like, oh yeah, I'm happy, I'm living the dream, everything is cool. Look, I bought another, I bought a Sloths from this crazy hardware hacker guy that makes open source hardware and other people assemble it. And then you go on Reverb and you find people who are making that stuff. And you could also make it yourself by just buying the faceplate, which is circuit board material, and the circuit board, and then getting all of the little surface mount parts and assembling them yourself. And I'm not good enough to do that. But you could be the person to be like, oh, this is cool. I've got the patrons and I'm getting these little things and I'm playing with them on videos and I'm making my weird techno music or progressive rock or whatever it is that I do. And some people just hate that. Yay. And then when you go, okay, I have too much stuff. I'm not using this thing anymore. I did this thing or that thing. Like over there, I've got a metronome where I made a little paper card and labeled what the tempos of things were because it was never really very closely aligned to the tempos. One way of getting around the I'm doing a Patreon, I publish my income, and then a bunch of people look at that and go, oh, you're making too much money. You shouldn't have that much money. People automatically react like, oh, well, that means that I have to be able to hide it because people have this unreasonable expectation that I shouldn't be making more money than them for doing stuff that I absolutely love and enjoy. I think that's a reasonable attitude. I think a lot of people are like, I'd really like it if I had that kind of luxury myself. So no, I'm not going to give you anything. So you make it worth their while. You make it like, tell you what, please do continue giving this money. And if it seems superfluous and I'm getting too many toys, guess what? I give some of my toys away. I'll give my toys to you. I just can't necessarily pick and choose that. So what I could do is just make a lottery, and kind of the whole idea of it is, since you can't just be like, I'm going to give this to a poor musician somewhere in the world, it's Secret Santa. Since that's not convenient, limiting it to patrons only is a lot more convenient because you can communicate with those people. But then doing it like, cool, you won the thing, therefore I am going to send it to you at my own expense, means that if I get rid of the roads, now that is not easy to ship. It's not easy to carry. It's not easy to move around at all. But if I was doing like, hey, he's making $20,000 a month. You got a new rose. It's better than the old roads. It's even cooler and stuff. So now I have a superfluous roads, and you're making $20,000 a month. No, I'm not. I don't think that's even technically possible. Some of the larger Patreons do that, but they're teams of whole people. And that's also something that can happen as you scale up, mind you. But if you're making $20,000 a month, you could choose to go, okay, any of my patrons, would you like a Rhodes? We're doing a lottery. You do the lottery, and the person that wins the Rhodes is some keyboard player like in the Bronx or in, Helsinki who really could use that. And what is so wrong with setting up a situation where you could be like, okay, this is going to cost me many thousands of dollars, but I am going to charter a plane and fly this to you, and then you will have that. And it'll be a very cool, amusing thing, and people will be like, oh, that's nice. And maybe the person will be like, I'm so excited. I'm going to be playing this all the time, because I started playing the Rhodes all the time when I got it. And maybe you've just helped somebody become more of an artist. And then if it's something like a freaking toilet paper roll, and I can make a bunch of these, and I'm like, I would like to give some of these away. I'm going to do my little lottery thing, and it's patron only, but you don't pay shipping. Instead, I just give this to you if you win it. I think that would help enormously as far as people being, say, on Patreon, doing stuff publicly, and then getting around that that popular feeling, which is going to be more or less happening, of you are taking in more money than you deserve. Because I think that is a legitimate thought. It's just a sliding scale. And sometimes it's going to be a sliding tiny toilet roll subwoofers. Yeah, I did a live stream of making giant cardboard subwoofers. And my way of thinking around that kind of stuff is there is a legitimacy to asking that question. There's legitimacy to being, and I'll tell you why, to being the person that's like YouTube famous or something, and you've gone viral. You did something, maybe you do videos of yourself walking down the street and tripping and falling on your face. Like it's a Vine thing. People think it's so funny. I mean, hell, Rowan Atkinson was really good at that kind of thing. You're so good at falling on your face that you can do these videos of tripping and falling on your face and you go viral. What going viral means is you've latched onto something that the internet does. It is not based upon quality. It is not based upon worth. It's just a mechanism by which people will look for like the best tape emulation or the funniest, prank video or whatever. And because the internet is frictionless, what you do is you're doing your thing and then you happen to be the one that becomes famous for doing that. That means that people will naturally be directed to you rather than to other people for doing the thing that you do. And you probably deserve it. You probably are better, you're 20% better at doing the thing than anybody else. So if people have to choose one or the other, they're all going to choose you if they get to choose the 20% better thing. So they all go to you. So you have all the business rather than 20% more. You have all the business because it's frictionless. All of the attention went to you. That's what viral is about. That's what the internet is about. That means that when people look at the person who's like also falling on their face for the internet and they're 20% less good at it than you, they look at them and go, oh, that's kind of funny. And they look at you and go, oh, that's kind of funny. Or why are you a rich person and this other person is a poor person? That seems completely unjust. I do not wish to do anything with, And so people go and flip out and are like, you should be punished for being this wealthy, greed-head person that's taking all the money and all these worthy people aren't getting the... But as the person that was viral, you didn't do it. I'm going to have to be reading some of this chat as well because I'm seeing comments going on. So the idea is, I guess, finding ways of balancing stuff out, honestly. Let me go and, oh, nice Snuggie. Yeah, I actually bought this bathrobe for YouTube because I was going to do a thing called Beetroot, which is now a wiki site. And Beetroot was going to be my live streaming. I was going to be using the synthesizers as the mysterious monk in the monastery, playing the music and stuff. And then by Sleep Circle, was going to get to talking about them. But I'll catch you later. Other streams are likely to not dive into this because it's not always going to be about the same subject. So I'll catch you later. But as it happens, it's kind of cold in Vermont in winter. And this is insanely warm, so I just started wearing it all the time. Like if I was wearing normal street clothes, I would be getting really cold around about now because the heating, you have to pay for heating. And this is a really effective way of staying warm in a Vermont winter. We're getting really random, and I probably shouldn't go for that much longer unless people really wanted me to, so let me look through some of this. I was just getting to... Oh, no, don't worry about it. I was getting to actually talking about the stuff that you raised, Sleep Circle, but mostly to say it's okay if people are stingy and vindictive because you don't have to be personally. There's a way through it. There's a way to do stuff where you don't have to worry about people being stingy and vindictive because there are people that you can connect to and that are willing to like jump on your Patreon or whatever. So you just be the kind of person that you want to be and get connected with enough of those people. That's why I'm such a big fan of Patreon, because Patreon is like, you know, where the viral problems are being caused by the frictionless fact of all that. Patreon means that it can be frictionless caring about people, and it doesn't have to take too much from anybody in particular. You just have to make your little crew and go from there. So it's possible to not worry about whether anybody is being stingy or vindictive or not, and taking advantage of that sort of frictionless aspect of it. I'm looking at some of the scroll back here. One of the Jolie says, if you concerned yourself with what people think, then you wouldn't be making plugs for the public to begin with. And that's kind of true. One of the reasons I keep talking about how I'm making these weird little plugins that I wouldn't be able to do if I wasn't on Patreon is because that is a positioning statement. You know, this stuff all has its purpose. It even fits into the category of what you'd call marketing, and you can buy books on these sort of things. And I've read all sorts of books like that over the 10 years that I was running as a commercial enterprise. And that's what told me that I could make some of those decisions about like not abusing my customers or not just rolling over and doing the most popular thing I could possibly do at any given moment over and over and over again. You're allowed to do stuff like that that will target what you'd call a smaller audience or a niche audience. When you're doing viral stuff, what that means is you will not become viral. But as long as you can find your crew, as long as you can find a group of people, then not becoming viral doesn't have to be toxic. You can just be doing your own thing. And it's kind of like Frank Zappa starting his career in music. He was like, I'm going to find stuff that nobody's doing because that's a missing area. And if you can find a missing area, that means you can do the thing. And then somebody will like it. And he was absolutely right. So when you're doing stuff that you like, that's kind of what keeps you getting out of bed in the morning. You could also do stuff that you hated and that was really obscure. It would just be kind of sad. It's not as much about like you must do the things that you like and love. It's like that is what will please you more as you're doing stuff at whatever level you're at. Now let me see. I really need to keep on scanning through this stuff and catching up. Gamma 1734, yeah, maybe I will end up giving you my roads one day, but not today. I still like it. Producing magnetodynamic infundibulator. The question is, how much line production could I even do? I'm catching up rather rapidly, I think. At some point we might be able to talk about some of these things. But we're catching up to people wanting me to talk about the Illuminati, and that's a very funny topic, but I don't think that that's the most productive thing I could be doing. Go find me on like Reddit or something in order to get more into that. Oh, nobody's dead. Would you ever make a Spring Reverb plugin? Well, funnily enough, I made a thing called Pocket Verbs back in the day that was audio unit only. And that is in the queue as far as stuff that I'm putting out. And as such, there is a Spring-oriented plugin that will be coming out. I'm not sure if it's really that good. of a spring simulation. I don't think it would quite nail it as much as some impulse responses and things do, but I do have a kind of spring-esque thing going on. And I also learned something very cool that will, to some extent, affect pocket verbs. Because what I discovered was this. I did pocket verbs because I was going to do a section of little plugins or a plugin with little options on it and just experiment with different combinations of all-pass filters and delays and things. In particular, I wanted to do something where you could do a chain of all-pass filters. And because I'd read somewhere like, oh, you could do this. And I did. I called it Zarathustra. And it's one of the pocket verbs options. And then I discovered that the old Alesis MIDI verb and MIDI verb 2, I think MIDI verb 2 specifically, had a thing called Bloom. And that was basically just a big chain of all passes, much like what I did in Zarathustra. So there is history, and that's probably where I got the idea, was somebody was talking about it. And having done that, I learned a new thing about the early MIDI verbs, and you probably can't see it, but I've got one right here. This is the original MIDI verb, the kind with the RCA jacks on the back, really primitive. And the MIDI verb and the MIDI verb 2 have a interesting detail that I learned because Sean Costello from Valhalla was talking about it in a thread. They don't have a multiplier. So they don't have normal gain control. So I'll tell you what they do have. This MIDI verb that I've got, and MIDI verb 2, and none of the ones afterwards, do all of their gain changing using bit shift gain. It's literally how that works. There you can buy, on the used market, hardware reverbs, primitive old hardware reverbs, using lots of all-pass filters and stuff, where they're limited in the kind of algorithms that they can do because they cannot do normal gain changes like multiplying something by 0.8 or whatever, or the typical all-pass formula of 0.618. Instead, all of their multiplications and divides are like 0.5. Everything inside them is bit shift gain. And we know that using bit shift gain has some interesting qualities because if it's a floating point, you're just changing the exponent. You're not, and I don't think they're necessarily using floating point internally, but when you do that, you have super pristine audio quality out of digital words because you're not changing any of the stuff within the digital word. You're just shifting the bits along. So you're doing a 6 dB jump up or down. So these digital reverbs have unusually pristine lack of quantization. Every gain change inside them, with their delays and things and all that kind of stuff, all the gain changes inside them are in this super pristine level where there's never a shift in any of the crystal of the digital word is kept perfectly. So I discovered that, so I'm going to be including that in some of the work on pocket verbs and maybe the spring reverb, and certainly like Zarathustra. I'm going to be doing stuff where it's like, okay, now we're doing all passes, but it's all done this way. Therefore, let's have some old MIDI verb school reverb algorithms. And it'll be done using the full resolution of audio units and VST plugins. It's going to be done in floating point, but floating point also is subject to bit shift gain. And I think that's really going to work out quite well. I'm looking forward to what I get out of it. So that is the reverb talk there. Now, DS. Yeah, here's the thing. I had to take into account the fact that the fellow from Scandinavia who was complaining loudly about it is right in terms of he found that there was high frequencies that get rounded off some of the sounds in DS. Now, he's looking at a change that is like, and yeah, Tiki, I think you mentioned that before. You were looking for the, like, solo the effect kind of thing. If that's, is that what a delta control is, or am I misunderstanding? It seems reasonable. I'm thinking about that as well. That'll be coming along, and I'm probably going to call it Deep S because it's funny, but probably only with one S, so DBES. But that'd be the one where I can greatly expand the range at which it senses over, and that would stop the highs loss much more effectively. It'll also change the way it acts, so you'd be wanting to dial it in, but it would make the whole thing suppress non-S effects much more. And you'd need to be able to adjust it, because if you made it be too extreme, it would probably not attack and release as nicely. It's all a variation. But yeah, the changes that the guy was noticing were like 60 dB down and so on. And I got a little salty over that simply because this whole effect is also something that people use to cut off or treat unpleasant high frequency behaviors in sounds that they've recorded. Like people can put DSs on things like cymbal overheads or guitars or who knows what. And that's not necessarily a negative thing. You could say it's similar to doing acceleration, and acceleration is an even less particular version of very much the same kind of thing. The whole idea is to have it be a continuous algorithm rather than a threshold, because if you have a threshold, you will hear it when it kicks in and shuts off. So I like having it do that, but I did have to admit that, yeah, it will sometimes affect some of the sounds that aren't specifically S's. And my take on it was like, well, but maybe that's fine. Why are you so worried about containing, hanging on to all these incredibly high frequency obtrusive details anyway? And he's like, because they're lead vocals. And I'm like, okay, you got it. I hear you. But I do feel that there is merit in not using the most extremely isolating behavior and having some of this stuff come up, because I don't think everything that you care about in a sound is contained in the highest of frequencies. I mean, some folks are capable of capturing a lead vocal in such a way that they are incredibly close up and they are incredibly aggressive, and I'm not sure that's always musically right. If it's not musically right and you needed to have a voice be like a little bit more chill, it would be one of the best ways you could possibly do that. And it's not necessarily a given that just because it touches other parts of the audio, that's bad or even detracts from the vocal. But if you wanted to utterly and totally not touch anything other than the S, it's a completely legitimate complaint. I just get salty when it's like, this is the only thing that you should ever care about, therefore this fails and is complete loser and it's the worst. And it's like, no, it's not. It's really not. This is just another way of doing things. And this is the trade-off that I'm making. And I'll try to optimize it a little bit. So there's DS. What is the range affected? Let me see. I'm going to go to my DS page, or something like it. Oh, I mistyped it. I typed air windows dress. I guess the bathrobe counts as sort of an air windows dress. Anyways, I'm having a look, and I'm not actually seeing it because I've got my little video on. So you're asking what the lowest range is affected? I've got 3 controls on it. It's intensity, max DS, and frequency. Which do you mean? Tiki is in the please don't let it affect anything else camp. Actually, I didn't have a MIDI verb when I was that age. I'm 50, but I didn't have any of these cool things before the last 10 years or so. I'll tell you where I got the bathrobe. It's another Amazon thing and stuff. People really want to find what this bathrobe is, I can find it for you. But let me see. I'm going to go and look back at that again. When you say, what is the range for the band where the magic happens? That's very difficult to describe. You're perhaps talking about the top slider? Because the thing is, you're saying with the lowest knob, and I tend to think of the top slider as where the magic happens, because that's the one where there's this one point where it starts affecting stuff and not affecting other stuff. The lowest knob is not stated in hertz, and it is nothing more than a fairly laid-back Air Windows low pass. And this is one of those plugins where I was adamant that you should be using your ear, especially since it's only kicking in on S's and stuff. You just caught me being fussy about it. And oddly enough, I think max DS is expressed in dB, so go figure. But this is one of those ones where I'm like, oh no, use your ears, man. And the frequency is not in hertz. What it'll do is if you crank the frequency all the way up to 1, it's not filtering at all. Whereas if you lower the frequency, you got a low-pass filter going on, and that's simultaneous with max DS, so that you're ducking it, but you're also filtering it at the same time. And I think it goes down to the upper mid-range, not really any farther than that. It's certainly not going to take out bass. If you wanted to investigate it, it might be visible in the video. I'm not really sure. Can't actually watch it for the purposes of checking it out. But the gist of it is that it's going to go from cranked up all the way for high frequencies and then continually lower until it's almost like just ducking the entire audio, but not. And it's complicated by the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, this is one of my interleaved filters, so it is a very, very slow roll-off. Like, it's low frequencies, and then as it starts going into the highs, it's not really rolling off very. This is not a brick wall at all. And the reason for that is that the slower the roll-off, the less obtrusive the EQ move. So I can roll off highs that way and not have like a filter sweepy effect where it sounds kind of like a synthesizer. Quite the reverse. That's similar to what makes yesterday's release of Gatalope different from an envelope filter guitar pedal is those are sort of resonant, and Gatalope has a very slow high pass and low pass that are converging on each other. Now, okay, Cosmic Feed has just asked something. Something that plagued my imagination is a send-receive pair for custom feedback chains, or is it just impossible? Well, all the code stuff sometimes seems a little bit like magic to me as well. I understand DSP things, and I've put a lot of thought into why it is that digital sampling, as we know it, seems so unsatisfactory to me. Because when I was coming up, and didn't have gear and so on, and there was a very notable time once where a early digital thing had come out, and I was still pretty young. I was maybe teenage or thereabouts when that started really happening. And there was a David Bowie reissue called Golden Years that came out. And it's like the worst sounding vinyl record I've ever heard in my damn life. It's really shocking. And the reason is that it was super early digital, and they'd also made it super duper bright, which just makes matters even more worse. And it was also very loud. And the combination of those things meant that every high frequency noise on this record was just horrific. And that gave me the impression, because of course the record boasted how digital it was all over it. It's like, this is a DDA recording and it's digitally mastered and reprocessed for better audio quality. And then I'd listen to it and be like, this is complete garbage. What are you talking about? And I decided that digital was just an enormous scam and was terrible and was always going to be terrible. And wrote for the Absolute Sound magazine for a couple of articles, and they never paid me. And yeah, I was the biggest enemy of digital stuff for the longest time. And I had to work out what it was that was so obnoxious about it, because there were several different things, and it wasn't all about just the high frequencies. I remember there was this one time when me and another vinyl record audiophile friend, a guy named Ned Parsons that I went to college with, we were listening to radio, I think it was radio, and Aqualung came on, but it wasn't Aqualung, it was the Jethro Tull Aqualung record, but I think it was My God, the song that begins with piano, and it's like, people, what have you done? Locked him in your golden cage. Bing, bing. And we're hearing this come over the radio, and my friend's jaw just dropped, and it's like, it's just a voice. What happened? What changed it? And we're listening to it, and I'm getting what he's laying down, because through the CDification and the audio chain through all of that kind of stuff, it was very compressed and flattened, and all of the sort of emotive overtones that we were used to hearing off of the 1971 vinyl record that we each had multiple copies of and so on, that stuff was just squished. It was just squished by volume compression and quantization, and the combination of all of that stuff meant that the emotive overtones were completely obliterated. It was like, going through a cell phone or something. And then we listened to the vinyl record version, and yeah, it sounded like 15 feet farther away, and like there was a human being there who was tearing his guts out and being really worked up over the stuff that he was singing about. And one of the things that was happening was a more organic, it was coming off a vinyl record and a very decent playback system. So there was that organic quality going on. And then there was also the extremely intense overtones of the voice that were like 18 dB louder than they were on the radio version. So there turned out to be many reasons for our shock and dismay at hearing a completely different presentation. Yeah, it's been an interesting path doing all of this kind of stuff. And no, I've never thought of fronting a Jethro Tull tribute band. If anything, I could be playing guitar in a Yes tribute band, because I look a little bit like Steve Howe, and kind of always had, and I have the guitar for it, but it isn't set up correctly at the moment. It's Ibanez 175 copy, but I don't have the humbuckers and things in it, and I don't have the Fender Twin to run it into and stuff. And although I play with my fingers, I don't have Steve House drops, so that's not actually happening. But, you know, yay prog. So yeah, it's coming up on 12:50, and I've been chattering away for 2 solid hours. And if I make it 2 solid hours, that means I've got 10 minutes left. So has anybody got any further questions before I shut down the stream and go and get dinner ready or something? I actually don't eat lunch. I make breakfast and then I make dinner. So I have 2 meals a day, which is one of my economizing things. But it's also better for my health anyway. Yes, I'm not like running around digging ditches, so it's not like I need to be eating 3 hearty meals a day in order to, I would just become huge, and I don't want that, so we're not going to bother. Come to think of it, I should check on the live chat to see whether anybody is even still here. Ah, Tiki and Yuri are still here. Cool. So, you know what I would really like? Maybe I can do this sometime. All right. Yeah, there's a final thing. I've let people do this, and I've also had funny experiences. I think I'll spend like the last 10 minutes or so talking about a funny thing that happened. Oh, Jolie is still there, but not in participants. Cool. Cool. I've got people who aren't in participants. I can't necessarily look at the chat log participants list and get everybody who's here. First of all, for Yuri, I believe if you use that, that's me. It should be anyway. So there is a PayPal, and don't knock yourself out. Save money for yourself. I have, at the last 10 years, even before doing the Patreon, I have been very strict and stern with people about, like, don't give money that you don't have. Take care of yourself first. Partly because other people won't. Other people won't take that attitude. So I feel I can, and it makes me be a little bit different that way. But I also really mean it. So Yuri is mixing using plugins and Spline EQ from Photosounder. Oh, that's interesting. Check that out sometime. And Jolie has a question about ADT. I think you asked that before. I'm sorry, I did not answer that. Unfortunately, I can't answer that because it's going to be different every time. That's not why I didn't answer it. I would have. I just got caught up in talking about all the other stuff that was showing up. But yeah, the reason I can't tell you how to get the classic John Lennon ADT effect is because it's unfortunately different every time. But what you might want to do is dial in one tap of the ADT, have it in phase rather than out of phase, and then just sort of do it by ear. Try to find something that seems about right, at about the right level, about the right amount of delay. And that would probably do it. But this is one of those things where you really got to do it by ear, because the thing is, John Lennon's voice won't necessarily call for the same delay that yours will. Yours might end up wanting to be slightly different because maybe the reason they hit on that particular delay in the John Lennon track was because he had a kind of a nasal voice or whatever, and some cancellation made it sound good. And then as they're fooling around, Lennon's listening to the playback going, no, there, do it right there. Because there was a quality in his voice he didn't like, and one of the cancellations in the effect took that out. And so he would be like, yeah, at that exact point, that wouldn't necessarily help you. That would just only help him. So what you need to do is do what he did, do what Jeff Emmerich did, which is adjust it, listen to what it sounded like, and listen for those good points where it's doing what you want. That would be the true way of getting the classic John Lennon ADT effect, is not replicating, and this is always useful for all kinds of plugins and mixing. Rather than get the exact settings of the thing, go for the purpose of the thing. If you can replicate the purpose of it, then you're getting the classic effect. If you only replicate the settings of it, but it doesn't fit as well with your particular audio, then you're not getting the effect, even if you mimicked it perfectly. Go for the purpose of what's being done. And then I've got a second to last question, which is, well, maybe, I don't know how many more questions we're going to have. We'll see. Is EQ and C-strip based on density, or what saturation does it use? I think one of the things I can do, since everything is open source, is that I can go and look at my own source code online. And that's pretty cool, so I'm going to go and do exactly that. Although it might bobble my feed a little bit. Hopefully not too much. So there's Air Windows, plugins. I'll look at the AUs because those are the first ones I go to. And there's C-strip. C-strip C++ is where I'll find it. And scroll right down. It's a rather large plugin. I don't usually make them this complicated. The high passes and low passes don't have any form of density in them. But engage EQ. I've got a kind of high frequency boost that's actually out of energy. There's an extra factor in there. And then the drive section I'm looking at right now. Actually, that drive section is being how C-strip is done is it's progressively taking bands and sort of chopping them off using a simple IIR filter. So this is not a very high Q equalization. It's a very, very soft and gentle one. But you're right that it's using density. And it is using the original density configuration, but it is the full concept of density rather than just the boost version. And by that I mean it's using the original form of Air Windows density where you can go to negative. The code says produce either boosted or starved version. And this is actually, it's not the same as what console uses to do a thing and then replicate it. It's using a different one. It's taking a cosine. And so I guess you're not a big fan of Ricky Martin's La Vida Loca, one of the first over loud or maximized. Well, you know what I do have is Charles Dye's Mix It Like a Record DVD. I suppose I could give that away sometime if I wanted. I don't know, though. It's kind of fun. The funny thing about it is that Charles Dye, who mixed La Vida Loca, was right about some of the stuff he's talking about in doing that. And people are heckling me to this day for the amount of, be aware, Cosmic has thanked me for looking up the code. Be aware that I can do that. I may or may not be able to put it up on screen in future once I figured that kind of stuff out, put a window up on there. I'd probably need more than one monitor to do it properly. But, you know, in answering questions, because everything is open source, I can go through the code, look up what I did, and then explain it. So if anybody is also programming stuff and wants to be talked through how to do things, I could do that as well. But yeah, the funny thing about the volume leveler, spring mass, and damper, that seems like you could just use a variable and have the variable have momentum. And I have already done that. Check it out. Fritz, go and look up surge and surge tide. Surge tide is a compressor-like thing, and it is a digitally modeled spring mass and damper. The input that comes in is affecting how fast the volume level changes, or how fast the volume level change of the volume level changes. And that works just like a spring mass and damper, or multiple spring masses feeding into multiple dampers. So, yeah, I have managed it. Fritz, go and check out surge and surge tide, because that might be just what you need for a volume leveler. It's certainly better at that than it is at being a compressor, because it turns out you can't get compressor-like behavior from that very easily. It's just too slow to react. But it's very good at some of the things that it does. And yeah, La Vida Loca is interesting because it's one of the most obnoxious things, and yet at the same time, applying lots of little distortions in various places, ideally without lots of aliasing and stuff, is downright helpful. And so much of what I do, including things like Righteous that are about not being overcompressed and oversquashed, incorporate the same principles of applying distortions and saturations to things that Charles Dye was talking about when he did the Mix It Like a Record DVD, and when he was doing Livin' La Vida Loca and that famously loud Ricky Martin record, which is not necessarily the loudest ever anymore, but it's one of the ones that really exemplifies the intensity of lots of stuff that's distorted. Because it really does help get into a classic record kind of zone. There's a lot of stuff that I've liked in the past where part of the sound is just slammed and distorted all to hell. Like the bunch of old Creedence records and things like that. They weren't necessarily super hi-fi, because if you had them be super hi-fi, you would have these dynamic, like the difference between like I'm trying to think of a particular example. Probably Good Golly Miss Molly is the one I'm thinking of, and maybe I'm thinking of something else. Let's call it Good Golly Miss Molly off of an early Creedence record. The difference between that and, say, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, or Boston's first record, in part, is that the ultra clean 70s sounding records have much higher headroom. So the overtones of voices, the overtones of things, stick way out without being distorted. Whereas if you have an old rock and roll sounding record that's just a roaring mass of distorted noise, everything's being clipped, everything's being distorted. And often with gear that sounds really nice when you distort it, like if you put loud rock and roll through some kind of antique tube console, like early Beatles or whatever, just really primitive stuff, in the mixing stage, you have like tube circuitry distorting. And it is wiping out all of the super high peak energy and recording to tape. And if you slam it to tape, it'll wipe out the super high peak energy and make stuff sound sort of thicker and fatter and so on. And as a result, everything is super flattened and it's not realistic, but it sounds very rock and roll and it sounds very aggressive and exciting. So you can go both ways. You can either distort stuff, like Charles Dye became very good at doing, or you can leave all of the energy in there and go super hi-fi, which means you will sound super 70s. And you'll sound super kind of California, LA 70s, ultra clear and clean, and it's not really going to convey the same effect. You can't get there from here. You can't get to certain kinds of audio through honoring all of the sound and having everything be really clean and perfect. Now, Fritz is asking, how do the controls of surge type relate to spring mass damp? Only in the sense of that's how the algorithm is modeled. The algorithm is modeled on momentum of, like, if the compression is making stuff get quieter, it will continue to get quieter, and there will be momentum, and that's like the direction is the mass, and the spring is being able to only affect it slightly. There's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, pressure and all the pressure-related compressors have a little bit of that, but surge and surge tide are the ones where there's a lot of mass in the equation. So it's really smoothing out the fluctuations of how the compression works. And the reason to do that is because the way compression works, if you've got, say, a big peak, there's something that needs to be compressed, and you're going through and the compression is just like instantly cut it down to this, you get a sharp discontinuity there. And if it's a continuous waveform, I wonder if I have a picture that looks like one. Imagine this is flat. If this is a continuous waveform and you've got a compressor going on, the compressor is going to try to kick in at every single peak if it's cranked out. So every single little bit of the waveform is going to have a slight artifact as it tries to cut off and go back down, and then it will expand upwards until the next loudest point, at which point it'll cut back down again. And that's one of the issues with compressors, is that it's difficult to not have them affect the tone in that way. So if you have the mass damping kind of thing, what you're doing is saying, if you go beyond this certain point, then it starts to get louder and louder. And if it's turning back down again, it'll start to get quieter and quieter. But the effect being done by hitting the individual peak goes towards the direction that the volume is going, rather than specifically the volume itself. And that also means that peaks that are drawn in like that, if you're doing that, then the peak kind of gets through. The attack is not very fast, so the peak gets through, but then it starts volume leveling. As further peaks end up being too loud, it'll start turning itself down again. Okay, I think a final question. I'm going to take one more question from Oversight Entertainment because it's funny. And at that point, I will log off for now because I've gone a couple of hours and things slowed down a little bit. I won't say that things stopped completely, but I'll be back next week because, you know, I'm going to do this every week. And I'm going to put that on the website so that you can see, or people can see that that's something that I do. And we'll get more and more people involved asking questions. Hopefully people even programming and asking questions, and I can look it up in my source code and help them out. All that kind of stuff. And if that means it becomes a longer workday as far as live streaming, that's cool too. But their final question for today, Oversight Entertainment asks, do you mean that a plugin don't make you sound John Lennon? Nah. A plugin don't make you sound John Lennon. Love you guys. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.